So it's a great privilege and pleasure to have a chance to talk to George Steiner, whose lectures I attended 20, 30 years ago, and who is a distinguished literary critic. George, where were you born and when?
I was born in Paris in 1929. My father was of Czech origin, but had grown up and been educated in Vienna. My mother was Viennese, and by a miracle of foresight or of instinct, I would call it an instinct of apprehension, my father had left Vienna in 1924, convinced that a form of Nazism was coming, had transferred us to Paris, started his life all over again, and I was educated in the French lycée system and in France, but the key fact is I was educated totally trilingually. There was no difference between German, French, and English in my upbringing, in the home, in daily life, in every aspect of my childhood. This was really the central fact. And from a very early date on, my father sensed that English would probably be the world language, the language in which the future would develop. This flew very much in the face of French linguistic chauvinism, but it made for a very creative tension in my own growing up. And my mother was a brilliant linguist in her own right, and a Viennese grande dame. Now, Viennese grande dame meant a certain kind of enlightened cynicism and intellectual elegance, very, very much a woman up with the development of the world, and together I owe them everything. My bitter quarrel, bitter is an exaggerated word, my deep quarrel with psychoanalysis being that I regard it as utter nonsense. I neither wished to sleep with my mother nor to kill my father. They were the best friends I had in the world, the closest to me, in a relationship of constant fun and excitement. Now let me emphasize, my father was a very, very distinguished, internationally known investment banker, and had set himself one purpose in life, that I should never know anything of that business. He would not even tell me what the difference was between a bond and a share. That was almost the shibboleth of my education. He hoped and worked for the idea that I would be some kind of scholar and teacher. Now, let me immediately open a large and central footnote. That is a deeply Judaic point of view. The word rabbi, as you know, means teacher, nothing else. Rabbonim is simply the word for teacher. And if you ask me today, did my father in some way inhibit in me the hope of being a creative artist? I drew and painted a great deal as a child. The answer might be yes. Of course, he loved the classics. He read them to me. We studied them together. But somewhere in him and in the tradition which he stood for was the view that being a teacher was more important than being a creator. I put this in too abstract a way, but it's terribly important, and it determined perhaps the natural limitations in my own life. And he still lived to see me having a number of very major university chairs, and this filled him with a deep satisfaction. I think he would have been proud, of course, if I'd been able to be, let's say, a distinguished artist or novelist, but I don't think it would have brought him the same satisfaction.
And your mother?
My mother had as a goal to make of me someone who, having a rather severe physical handicap, would regard that as a privilege. Now, let me take that slowly because it's the other crucial element. From the beginning, not only did she refuse any compromise with ordinary life. For the first 8 to 9 years, I had to be in constant remedial treatment. It was very painful and very difficult. And at some very early date, I wish I could identify the moment, I can't, she said, "Do you realize how fantastically lucky you are? You're not going to do military service." And that is probably one of the turning points in my life. From that day on, I regarded myself as fantastically lucky. Footnote within footnote, she was right. She was, of course, totally right. God knows what would have happened to my life had I had to serve in the war. I didn't, and this turning a great handicap into a privilege, into a pleasure, was a stroke of pure genius. But she would not compromise. Already at that time, you had slip-on shoes, for example, or shoes with a zip. She refused. I went through hell learning to tie the knot on a shoelace. Not a very useful or necessary art, but morally an enormous triumph. I shall never forget the ecstasy of victory when I was able to achieve that. But it was painful and long and full of disappointment. So I owe to her not only the sense of being terribly lucky, being handicapped, but secondly, that there is nothing you cannot achieve if rightly guided, if there is someone who turns a difficulty into a joy. And that has, I think, presided over my whole life. So it was a pretty magnificent start.
Well, I think, if you don't mind, viewers will probably want to know what the handicap was.
Oh, it was a birth accident, a right arm without natural motion to this day. And it meant, at the beginning, it meant that the wisdom which obtained was, for example, use the left hand wherever possible. Let him write with the left hand. Mama decided that was completely wrong, and I fought my way through to writing as I do with the right hand. And she said there was no question of these nonsensical compromises with the inevitable. There was no inevitable for her, and my whole philosophy of education, my intense opposition to the present kind of therapeutic political correctness, is that, on the contrary, the handicaps, the difficulties, are the wellspring, not only of will and achievement, that's easy, but of joy, and that's much more difficult.
Did you have brothers or sisters?
Yes, I had a sister 7 years older than myself. I recently lost her. That age distance meant she really looked after me or took care of me more than a sister normally would, because I was so young and she was already a teenager, and that was very important during the war and during the times that led up to our next move, which was to the United States.
What was the role of religion in your childhood?
My father was an utter Voltairean, very ironic Voltairean. So was my grandame mother. She taught me, the only prayer she taught me was, I am bad, I could be better, but it really doesn't matter. She had me say this as a very young child, and it has guided my life. On the other hand, we marked a number of the high holidays out of piety towards my parents' parents and out of solidarity with the Jewish community, not in a religious sense, in a sense of history. My father taught me a great deal of Jewish history and Jewish philosophy and Jewish thought, but entirely in an agnostic or Voltairean vein.
Did you go to school in France to begin with? And
Yes, indeed I did. And I went both to a French lycée in the neighborhood, as everybody did, and then briefly to the American school in Paris to get the English in absolutely good shape.
Were there any teachers there who particularly influenced or
That comes
impressed you?
later.
Yeah.
Remember, we escaped from France by miracle in 1940, and 1940, and I'm just on to becoming 11 years
Yes.
old. So the great influences will come later in New York.
What was the miracle?
Oh, the miracle was getting out. My father already was in the United States on a French government mission, and got permission to ask Mama and his two children to visit him, and the visit turned into a rather long one. We were able to leave with the last American ship that got out of Genoa before Mussolini closed the harbor and invaded France and so on.
So you went down to Italy from
Paris. Because couldn't get out, no ship was going to France, but we got out through Genoa.
What can you remember your first arrival in America?
Yes, my father, you laugh at this, and it shouldn't be said openly, but it is now known. It's appeared in a number of biographical essays. On the dock, my father said to me, "Remember, we're going back." That was the first words he spoke to me. Mama was very upset about this because she rightly felt, let's make a go of it in the United States. And my sister fell promptly in love with America because being a late teenager in France was hell, and it was heaven in America.
Was it heaven for you or not?
No. My father saw to it that it wouldn't be, and I remember there were very bitter moments, of course. I remember the night, that we could date easily, Google would do it for us, on which he woke me saying, Marshal von Paulus has surrendered at Stalingrad. We're going to be on the way home. I shall never forget them. It might take a long time, but he knew from that moment on that the war was won. And that had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor or American intervention. It was the Red Army had made sure we would one day go home.
So you now go to a new school.
And a brief experiment in a very coveted American high school, which went very, very wrong. I hated every moment of it, and the turning point was very, very amusing because it's a story against ourselves. They have in America something called Parents' Day, and the parents come and sit in on class, and it was the class in ancient history, and we were asked, why did Herodotus praise Athens so much in his history? Answer, he was paid to do so. My father took me out that day, out of this distinguished American school, and put me where I wanted to go in the French Lycée in New York. Footnote, the answer was perfectly right. Contrary to my father's idealistic beliefs, Herodotus was bribed, but thereby hangs a quite different tale. And I blossomed in the French Lycée. It was exactly right for me, and I did have one or two great teachers. Why? Because people of international renown were earning their living teaching children in the French Lycée. Some of them, like Maritain, like the great Lévi-Strauss, like Gilson, the medieval historian, then got university jobs. But for quite a while, jobs. But for a while, they were teaching kids in the Lycée. So just imagine, I had some of the great stars of the mind teaching me.
You had Lévi-Strauss?
Yes, Lévi-Strauss. Then he was teaching. He was helping teach geography, I think. I'm not sure he knew any, but why not? He then got his appointment to the Advanced School of Studies, but I went to his lectures in my last years at the Lycée, because it was easy in New York to attend those lectures which were given by this brilliant French intellectual refugee community.
You've been quite interested in Lévi-Strauss for many years afterwards, haven't you? It started with this period, presumably.
It certainly started then. It then was renewed when I realized he was a distant cousin of Proust.
Yes.
And when I came to realize that Triste Tropique, whatever its anthropological merits, which I'm not qualified to judge, is one of the ultimate classics of French prose.
And he was a good lecturer.
No, and was certainly briefly there. Maritain was a magnificent lecturer, and there were scholars of every kind, and then one day a lady with a leather skirt, a curious detail which stuck with me, marched in with a Mexican brooch which covered her ample front, and gave us a guest lecture about why we should be interested in philosophy. She was a lady called Simone de Beauvoir, and she was doing a lecture tour of the United States. So I was spoiled.
And were you persuaded why you should be interested in philosophy?
Totally.
Were you already beginning to get interested in any particular topics or disciplines by this time?
Yes. The multiplicity of languages was the condition in which I lived. And, for example, some of the teachers who had escaped wouldn't speak a word of English, the idiots, in order to keep their French pure and in order not to yield to American vulgarity. Others learnt further languages. I had colleagues who were learning Spanish in New York and doing it very, very well. I was interested in the problem of the relations between language and thought, language and existence, language and identity, very, very early on, naturally from my home.
Do you think identity, given that you're between so many different traditions and cultures, is one of the central interests you've always had?
It is central, and it is the reason I've always been marginalized by the deep provinciality of English academic life, by its refusal to learn languages. This is a monoglot country. In my Geneva seminar, around the table, there were at one point 15 languages spoken by my doctoral students, which is what comparative literature and the study of philosophy is really about. Yes, it was utterly determinate. But in America, bear in mind that from the tip of Manhattan, where it goes into the Atlantic, to the northern tip of Long Island, there are 128 languages spoken. And that has become more so since the 40s and 50s, but it was already a Babylonian metropolis.
So you felt at home there with all these languages?
I felt that part I delighted in, as I did in the tremendous availability of every kind of music, of art. The New York Public Library is probably one of the world's great universities. Why? Because they let in young students and they help you and they guide you. It was at that time an incomparable instrument of learning.
And you were quite close to it, were you? Or?
No. The French Lycée is high up on 96th Street, but there was a bus always straight down Fifth Avenue.
Were there things about America, obviously in that first school, that you didn't take to, didn't you?
I couldn't accept the lack of irony. I couldn't accept the kind of ostentatious, already at that time, patriotism, pledging allegiance to the flag and so on. It was very alien to me, very strange. And the Judaism I came from, the historical one, was not, of course, the observant or very committed one of the New York Jewish community.
The lack of irony has always been a puzzle to many people. I have my theories. What are your theories?
It's a land committed to things being better next Monday than they are this Monday. It's a land committed to the dream that more people will be happy than ever before in any political community. And irony is the enemy. Irony subverts. De Tocqueville already senses that in his great study of American democracy. Irony is being rather nasty about hope. And in America, being nasty about hope is lèse-majesté.
That's very interesting. So you're now how old? About 16, 17?
16, 17. I did my French post-baccalaureates, which were sent out the exams from Paris. It was a good Napoleonic system. Every French lycée overseas, and there were three great ones in the New World: Montreal, New York, and, if I'm right, Rio, had the same exams at the same hour, at the same as at Paris. I had both my baccalaureates, and my father, with great effort and pride and sacrifice, made it possible for me to go to Yale. Now, Yale, they had something called Orientation Week. In my case, that was a fatal mistake. I went up for that Orientation Week, and the first man to meet me on campus was a boy who had been in the lycée 2 years before I'd been. And he said, "Don't come here." And I said, "Why?" He was himself Gentile, distinguished. And he said, "There's no place here for Jews," in a friendly, helpful way. Now let's be very careful. The first Jew to get tenure at Yale was 1948, a man called Hempel in mathematical logic, which was regarded as a crazy marginal field, H-E-M-P-E-L.
Very famous, yes. Yeah.
A very famous mathematical logician. There was no place for Jews. It was a ghetto. And what was I going to do in September, with every other university filled and open, I had read Time magazine, the instrument of all human knowledge, about this fantastic place called the University of Chicago, where there was a revolutionary, completely new idea. You came, you sat all exams in whatever field you wanted to sit them in, and if you got an alpha, you didn't need to take the subject. So out storms an arrogant, impossible little French lycée creature, me, and I sat 14 final exams. 10 I got alpha, and 4 I got gamma minus. Now, that was a great revelation. They were mathematics, physics, biology, and something I didn't know what the word meant, social science. I did not know, I'd never heard of that in the French. And so into biology, physics, math, and social science went young Mr. Steiner, working around the clock. I fell in love with science, deeply, hopelessly, the point being that the teachers were the ultimate teachers. I had Fermi in physics, and Fermi said to us at the opening class, I remember that as clearly as you sitting here opposite me today, there is no textbook because we all have to learn together. We don't yet know what nuclear physics is. And Urey, U-R-E-Y, another Nobel in chemistry, and a man you certainly know about in social anthropology called Redfield.
Yep.
And I fell in love utterly with science and had a fantastic time at the university and was able to do my BA in 1 year, which would mean that I could go into graduate school at the time when others were just starting undergraduate work. Whether that's a good thing, I leave for others to judge. So I march in head high, nose high, to what was called in America your graduate advisor. He was a great mathematician called Kaplansky, K-A-P-L-A-N-S-K-Y, Kaplansky, great mathematician. He called for my exam papers. I had a first, I had a summa. And he said, you are technically an idiot, that in the Aristotelian sense. Having been fantastically trained in the French lycée system, you have an absolute memory, and you learned endless formulas by heart. There's not a spark of mathematical creativity. Please don't try to go into science. Big footnote. They had a sign over the gate in Chicago of the science block, nuclear physics or bottle washing. Now, had this happened 5 years later, when a young gentleman called Jim Watson had the same interview, and he's very weak in math, they sent him to biology next door, with the results the world knows. I just came in at the height of the nuclear obsession, where they really thought all science was physics, and rightly you need creative math to do physics. I was utterly heartbroken. But I began with 2 very great teachers in literature and philosophy. The philosopher whom you'll know about was a man called McKeon, M-C-K-E-O-N, the great Aristotelian, and I had in literature the critic, poet Alan Tate, T.S. Eliot's close colleague and friend, T-A-T. But it took me a long time to get over the disappointment. I never have. So some years ago, I published a paper in Nature on the French mathematician Galois, G-A-L-O-I-S, the creator of modern topology, and sent it to Kaplansky and got back a postcard. Dear Steiner, I have no regrets for doing a service to literature. and it determined my career in the sense that the wish to live among scientists at the Institute in Princeton and then at Churchill College, Cambridge, arose, of course, from this deep shock, from this disappointment.
Can I just go back to Robert Redfield, because he is a folk hero in my discipline. You were lectured by him, or?
Yes.
And was he an interesting, good lecturer, or interesting mind?
No. The material was absolutely fascinating. For example, in order to learn what social anthropology is, I read Malinowski, my first, and a huge book by Myrdal called The American Crisis, isn't it?
Yes.
Or the American Dilemma.
Yes, Dilemma.
Dilemma, sorry. And yes, I learned a great deal, but more from the reading than from him.
So you're now doing a postgraduate
I've begun
degree.
doing both, and then comes one of my little autobiographies called Errata, with good reason. Now comes a huge erratum. Harvard offers me a full scholarship. And little snob that I was, and it's pure snobbery, I took it. Instead of staying at Chicago, where I was utterly happy and getting the best education, I tailed it off to Harvard and fell into black depression. It was boring, snobbish, old-fashioned. It was all that Chicago wasn't. And I owe everything to what we call in Yiddish an untranslatable word, chutzpah, meaning insolence, arrogance, Hutspe, but that's a bad transliteration. I wrote to Hutchins, the Chancellor of Chicago, saying, I've made a ghastly error. Will you give me one of your 2 nominations for trying for a Rhodes Scholarship from Illinois? He wrote back very rightly saying you should have thought of that before you left for Harvard. I wrote again saying I have not a leg to stand on, but I think I can win it for you. My arrogance was limitless. And Chicago hadn't won it in many years, being a non-athletic, counter-mainstream university. So amused by this arrogance, he let me have the nomination. I won it and was able to say to Harvard goodbye and head for Oxford.
How long had you been at Harvard?
1 dreadful year.
1 year.
Now, I've since then they've given me their highest honor, the Eliot Norton Professorship of Poetics. That is their top. I've had every Harvard guest lectureship. At the time, I swore I would not put my feet in that place again. And probably our relations could be defined when I went to say goodbye to the chairman of the English department. He was actually shaking with physical rage, and he said, one thing I can promise you, you will never get a teaching post in the United States. Harvard regarded itself, still does, not only as primus inter pares, which it is, but as above any normal human law or aspiration. So with that curse upon me, off I went to Oxford.
Right. So you're now how old? About 20?
19 or 20.
20.
Yeah.
When you had started your postdoctoral work, what was the theme of it at Harvard?
At Harvard, I took an MA, which you could do in 1 year. I had some good courses in comparative literature, which Harvard taught, but I was working mainly in the Romantic period, which also was what I hoped to do my DPhil on at Oxford.
Which Romantics? I mean, the German, the English?
No, English.
English.
I'd begun work, which I'd carried on at Oxford, on why these great, great writers, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Shelley and Keats, failed totally in the theatre, why they tried over and over to write successful dramas and to break into the stage, and each time fiasco. So I was very interested. Their poetry is full of drama, etc., and of dramatic genius. What went wrong?
And now you come for the first time to England?
No, I was here for the Silver Jubilee of George V with my parents, standing or sitting on top of the shoulders of somebody in the crowd. But this was the first adult time in England.
And what was your feeling at arriving in Oxford?
A great wonder and bewilderment. A bewilderment not about the physical toughness you had to have. At Balliol, we had a Scottish master who believed...
Lindsay, was it?
Lindsay Keir.
Lindsay Keir, that's
who
right.
believed that misery was the right instrument of human education. A very tenable view. So walking across the courtyard to take a shower, these were the worst years of rationing, 49, 50. The Shinwell winter, there was no coal. bread had been cut to below the war. There was less bread than during the war. The smell of egg powder and of whale steak will never leave me. You're rightly smiling and saying, you know, that isn't the worst of misery.
I'm smiling because I was in Oxford in the same years. I'd just come back from India, so...
And you remember some of that.
Yes.
And then I realized nobody was interested in English, in a D.Phil. It was regarded as an American import, very unwelcome. The idea of a prize fellow or research fellow doing a D.Phil was completely out of the question. Today, everybody elected to All Souls is told to get a D.Phil. Enormous difference. And there came the wonderful beginning of Waterloo, or Philippi. My supervisor was a man called Hugo Dyson, D-Y-S-O-N, at Merton. You will have seen him in a film called Darling with Julie Christie. He plays the Don. It was filmed in his magnificent rooms at Merton. Hugo said to me, I'm not the slightest bit interested in research, which is an American-German invention, but I'm an honest man. This is totally true and unbelievable. The fee is 8 guineas a term for my supervision of you. I'm not going to supervise you, but we will go and spend it either at a good dinner at the Bear in Woodstock or at a play in London. Every penny will be spent on us two having a good and instructive evening. Just don't ask me to read your bloody nonsense. This is a completely true story. Result is that when the Viva came, under the presidency of a lady called Helen Gardner, later Dame Helen Gardner, the room was packed. There was a queue. Why? Because I'd begun publishing quite a bit in London of critical articles and essays. I'd made a nuisance of myself. So there were a lot of people who smelled what would happen. Dame Helen said to me, cricket may be the most boring, silly game on earth. Nobody forces you to play it. If you play it, you have to learn the rules. Nobody forced you to go for a D.Phil. You have an immense future. But if you want a D.Phil, you have to know what a correct textual note is, what a proper edition is, how one writes a footnote, boom, boom, boom. It was a catastrophe, right? She was absolutely right. And I was already having a wonderful job on the editorial staff of The Economist. I'd won a contest to get the job on The Economist, to write editorials on foreign policy and on Anglo-American relations. A lovely salary, a nice room in Kensington. I was envied beyond words by the successful D.Phil candidates. All right, right. But it hurt terribly.
Who was the co-examiner? There must have been 2.
Yes. A man from the University of Edinburgh, whom I have for Freudian reasons suppressed for a moment. It'll come back to me, whose sarcasm was justified, whereas hers was an open challenge. Hers was an instructive, didactic challenge.
So you were failed, effectively.
Completely. And already the book, which would be The Death of Tragedy, was more or less ready. And it was lying in my drawer at The Economist. And one day, and again, I don't think you'll get a more curious story from any of your distinguished interlocutors. I'm told that there is someone from Oxford downstairs at The Economist who would like to see me. In a coat down to the ground, he was a clergyman, but no longer in orders, huge black hat, I'm Humphrey House of Wadham. I am secretary of the board of the English faculty. Is it true that you had no supervision? I said, yeah. Is it true that no one taught you what a D.Phil was? Yeah. That is a grave scandal. It is no compliment to you if you were too stupid, you were stupid to get help, but it is a grave dereliction he used a word which I didn't know was a beautiful word, a grave dereliction. And if you want to be taught properly and restart the whole process, I will take you on. He was a great scholar. The great Dickens letters,
Yes, I've read his.
the Clark lectures. He was a scholar, the Hopkins journals I've done by him. And there followed the most wonderful experience. Geoffrey Crowther, my boss at The Economist, the famous editor, said, right, the London Library, we will help pay your membership. It's around the corner. It was literally 20 yards around the corner. And you will have 1 day off a week to do your research. And we're keeping you on. We want you on The Economist. But if you want to do this, imagine the liberality of mind, the insight. He said, you'll never need it with us. You'll never need it. But if that's what you want to do, and by God, I worked my head off, and Humphrey House dies 3 days before my viva. But he knew already. Helen Gardner had told him. It was a congratulatory viva. And
did she examine it again?
yes,
Really?
indeed she did. Indeed she did, and to congratulate. And I said to myself, and I'd just gotten married, I said to myself and to Zara, I'll never need this again, forget about it, and I don't ever want to be called Dr. Steiner. So much for my insight into the future. But I wanted to be able, and it meant a great deal to my father, who had been very, very angry at the whole business. And I worshipped Humphrey House. He was a dark, sad soul, but a scholar. And I learned what scholarship might really be about.
How long did it take you?
Over 2 years to redo the whole thesis. But it was then Dr. Steiner. And it became then The Death of Tragedy, the book.
Did you wait until you'd redone
Yes,
it?
because thank God, had I published, I could not have redone the same subject.
And also, maybe the book would have been weaker in...
Certainly, but certainly.
So how much longer did you stay with The Economist?
Oh, a good deal. I had 4 wonderful years, and then came an assignment to go to the United States to cover the debate over the Atomic Energy Act and the founding of the AEC, a perfectly normal assignment for an economist, young journalist. And so I get an appointment, that was terribly difficult, but I get an appointment with Oppenheimer at the Institute in Princeton. And I go out on the little train, and I wait, and he finally says, I think I should make clear to you that I don't speak to journalists. So I said, Dr. Oppenheimer, I did have an appointment. Yes, I'm sorry, that may be a misunderstanding, but I don't want you to waste your time completely. There's somebody I want you to meet who'd be interested, the great Plato scholar, Cherniss, Harold Cherniss, the main leader. And Cherniss very welcoming, very warm in his office, and says, let's have lunch. And the table was George Kennan, Cherniss, Panofsky, and one other. And instead of despising me, they were eager to know about The Economist, but like children. How do you produce it? It was anonymously written at the time. How much does Barbara Ward do? Who decides the policy? They made me feel that I was the lucky visitor who could tell them. So Cherniss takes me back to his office. I have a strange guardian angel in my life, and he's working on a Plato text where there are lacunae. He's trying to work on emendations. Oppenheimer comes into the room and does a thing I believe is unforgivable. He sits behind us, which gives him every advantage. He curled up his long legs, his famous pipe, and sat on a table behind us and suddenly barked at me, isn't it silly to try to fill blanks in a text? What is the use of that? Deliberate provocation. I was by that time so angry and so pleased to be on The Economist that I said, I believe that is a silly remark, Dr. Oppenheimer, has always never been said to him. Mallarmé based his poetry in something he called les blancs, the missing, right? Much in modernism is based on the notion of Ernest Heidegger. And we went for each other, and suddenly his secretary, Werner Hobson, said, Dr. Steiner's taxi is waiting, because I was going on to Washington on the train. So Oppenheimer says, all right, let's go, get your taxi. I thanked Chernys for his hospitality, for his kindness. We walk out silently, and he suddenly says to me, are you married? I said, yes. He said, any children? I said, no. He said, that will make housing easier. That is a totally true story. And that is how I was elected the first young person in arts, an experiment, to the Institute for Advanced Study. Now again, big footnote, errata. I should have said, let me think it over. I should have got in touch with my bosses at The Economist and said, what do you think of this offer? I didn't. I took it on the spot. I was out of my mind with pride. The Institute for Advanced Study, Einstein's house, Gödel's house, Panofsky's house, the first young man. And The Economist very said to me, when you've made a mistake, you've made a big mistake, but if you want to come back, we will always want you, which was incredibly, it was a different time of history. It was a time full of elite generosity and elite gentility. And so my wife and I arrived one morning at Princeton. And we were asked to come to lunch in the cafeteria lunch. And we stand there and literally could not move by awe. How do you enter a lunchroom where the world's giants are sitting or taking their trays? And suddenly seeing us, I think we were shaking physically. Niels Bohr comes over and says, welcome, welcome, sit with me. We sit down with trays, unable to say a word. Niels Bohr again realizes this and pulls out of his ancient Danish waistcoat a photograph. My 12 grandchildren, and I know all their names. And within minutes, this Prince of Princes put us at ease and told us, come on, relax, you're one of us, you're going to be one of us. Not everybody. Simon Weil's great brother, André Weil, at the time the world's foremost algebraist, said to me very quietly in French, we will not have much to say to each other, but one thing I want you to get in your head, people with brains do algebraic topology and number theory. People with lesser brains like I, André Weil, do group theory. The rest is garbage. Le reste, c'est de l'ordure, in French. That was my welcome by him. Many were welcoming, many were not, because it was an Oppenheimer decision, an Oppenheimer experiment, and there was no guarantee at all that it would work. And I had 2 magnificent years, and out of that came further work, and the decision not to stay, even if he would have asked me to, he wouldn't have. It was a 2-year appointment. It was so unreal, and you were not allowed to teach. You were not, Princeton invited me to give courses. Oppenheimer vetoed it. You were not allowed to teach, and it would be difficult to describe to you the Byzantine atmosphere. There's no other way to put it. Oppenheimer had special envelopes made. As I'm not a great novelist, I can't invent this, for the monthly check, which would not make noise when slipped under the door. Now that was the atmosphere at the Institute. And one day Oppenheimer, near the end of my 2nd year, came in, and he certainly, I meant nothing to him. He said, I understand you want to go back to Europe. And I said, by rowboat, if necessary. And he said, there's a man who wants to see you in my office. Sir John Cockcroft, who had cracked the atom and was the first master-elect of something that didn't exist called Churchill College. and he said, we're looking for a director of study in the arts with a science background. The list is small, a very British put down, a very British put down. The list is small. And that's how I came to a muddy field full of water with blueprints, which I couldn't read, of course, to see the beginning of Churchill College.
Lovely. Can we just go back to the Institute for a moment? Were there, you mentioned 2 or 3 of the amazing people who were waiting in that queue as you got your lunch. Were there any others who particularly you either befriended or struck you?
Well, the great historian Kantorovich, who was the main living medieval historian, of course, was there. De Tolnay, Tolnay, the Michelangelo man, the main Renaissance art man. There were the whole department of scholars of ancient Greek and Latin. Yes, indeed. But I had come just after von Neumann and Einstein. So Gödel, the one G-O-D-L, I mean, who has changed everything. Do you know what his citation was at the Harvard honorary degree? Harvard, in its snobbery, does not announce who gets them before they get them. And there trots onto the stage with his heavy glasses a little man, and the citation was the greatest step in human thought since Descartes, and that was Gödel. He was there, of course. And that's one of the few deeply personal things Oppenheimer ever said to me. He said early on, you may think you've been made welcome in the house of Einstein, you've been made welcome in the house of Gödel. And probably true. Einstein himself often felt this, that Gödel had changed all human thought, that he had, age 24, when Gödel's proof made. So, but now I'm in Cambridge, at Churchill, and the fun of starting a place was immense, the sheer fun. We had Nissen huts in which to teach with the water coming in, but we started a number of revolutionary things like overseas fellows. We had brilliant people from America, Jack Barson from the start, and there were 3 students in English who had come desperately, not being able to get into any proper college, and it was an enormously exciting adventure. But from the start, I knew it wouldn't work. I had come, and Cockcroft had made me feel that he agreed that here was an opportunity to start new fields, that we should have linguistics, there were none at Cambridge, that we should have comparative literature, there was none, of course, at Cambridge. All sorts of hopes. I thought we would, and the people who warmly made me welcome, but warmly, were called Richard Keynes, Richard Adrian, Martin Wells, I could go on with it.
No, go on.
The high princes of Cambridge intellectuality, fellows of Trinity or Peterhouse to a man, who had come to join the new college with the one ambition to have as many firsts as Trinity. I mean, they didn't disguise this, which I thought was the most petty ambition for a new national college, for a college which had funds, which didn't know anything, in my opinion, to Cambridge. They saw it very differently. And so there was a warm, happy misunderstanding, in a sense, if you want, from the start. And then you had to be allowed to lecture as a fellow in college. And finally they had to move me to what's the biggest hall, Mitchell, to the Lady Mitchell Hall. Standing room only there. Why? I taught how to read a poem after Marx, Freud, and Levi-Strauss. You imagine the excitement for the bored multitude here. I taught as a seminar what is translation, the philosophy. I had more applicants to do doctorates than anyone else in the English faculty. This was going to be punished, and punished hard. And so then, as the law demanded, I was invited to apply for an assistant lectureship. That was the law. If you were a fellow and had lectured, you had to be given the chance of putting in for an assistant lectureship, and there came the famous interview, which has been so often described, has become legendary. Muriel Bradbrook and Huff in full gown, and I think you know the story. There was a copy of Encounter in front of them.
I'll tell it.
And Huff reads a sentence: to shoot a man because you disagree with him about Hegel's dialectic is a compliment to the human spirit. He said, did you write this sentence? I said, I should. Do you believe it? I said, yes. That was the end of the offer of assistant lectureship, and the end of... Whereupon, in its chivalric generosity, Churchill says, we don't give a damn about you having an assistant lectureship. Lecture in our dining hall, which is one of the biggest in Cambridge. Go on supervising. We will pay you a professorial fellowship. What Downing was doing for Leavis, the exact parallel, who also didn't have a lecture at that point still. And I thought hard about it. I loved the place. I loved my college. I loved Cambridge. My wife already was teaching. Leavis's students paid a terrible price. As Leavis couldn't examine nor be member of the boards that set the tripos, no, they paid a terrible price. They paid for his genius and for his belief that to be lecturing at Downing was more necessary and eminent, rightly, than any faculty post. And then he went to York, as you know. And there followed some very, very hard years. 2 children, 2 young children, no Cambridge job, a tiny college stipend, you know, tiny when you're a fellow, just a fellow stipend, but no.
But you were professorial.
No, I turned that down.
Oh, I see.
I turned all that down because I knew it would...
Oh, I see.
I wasn't going to play the Leavis game.
Yeah.
Not twice. Not once was bad enough in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And one day I began earning my living by freelance writing and by guest lecturing, with many American guest lectures, which meant also being away a great deal. And my father was already ill, very ill. He suffered from Hodgkin's disease. And he asked me to his favorite dining table in New York, at the hotel where he always had me for dinner. And I said to him, I've been offered chairs in comparative literature at, I think it was Chicago, and I think it was Yale or Columbia, I forget, 2 eminent American universities. Which do you think I should choose? And with the advantages, list A. And then he said, only you can decide. But if you do this, Hitler will have won. It meant there wouldn't be any Steiner left in Europe. I phoned my wife late that night, or whatever the time difference was, and said, rather than that contempt, I would sell shoelaces. I meant it. I'm not going to put up, I can't stand that, I can't face it, because I happen to agree with it. Indeed, Hitler would have won.
There are no other Steiners.
Well, he meant none of us.
Oh, none of you, yeah.
Of course, there are many, but not that many, but on the memorial tablets in Prague, there are about 30 members of our family who were gassed. So my father meant it in a very deep sense, that Hitler would then have driven me out.
Yeah.
And so that was very rough, and I was at a lovely university called Santa Barbara, a dream of a place where Crick then ended, and giving what the California called Regents Lectures, when the phone rang from Geneva, saying, you may remember that during the Italian Risorgimento under Cavour, there was founded the first chair of comparative literature anywhere in the world for a man called Sismondi, historian and a very distinguished man. And the name of it is Littérature Générale, which I prefer, which is a much more beautiful name. And we are restarting it. Funds have been gathered if you will accept it. And that's how it all happened. I'd never been. I'd been to Geneva on the train, passing through, and that's how it all happened.
What year is this?
I go to Geneva in 64.
64. And you got the phone call when you were in America, or?
In America, lecturing at Santa Barbara. And that they were prepared to devote the funds to recreating Sismondi's chair. And that's how it all happened.
Did you ask your father again about this, or?
Oh, he was so happy. He was so happy. He later dies in Zurich, and my mother also, by chance, 10 years later, dies on holiday in Switzerland. Very curious. Switzerland became decisive in my personal life, but much more in my professional life. And I owe to chance to teach in every language I knew. The rule was in my comparative literature seminar, which was doctoral seminar, this was not for undergraduates, that I taught the texts in the relevant language so far as I could. And that was a dream. The decision of my wife to stay here, not only this house.
You had already bought this house,
Yeah.
had you? Yeah.
Not only her new hall, she became vice president, not only that she's a historian of English, international relations, all the materials here, but something which rather haunts me. She's incredibly intelligent and gifted and totally monoglot. Totally monoglot, which is the irony of our marriage. Chomsky cannot say yes or no in another language. Chomsky's a total monoglot, for example. Big footnote, if I were a great psychological scientist, I would be working on the following problem. What are the three things? Tone deafness without a lesion in the ear, monoglottism, the inability to learn another language, and thirdly, what we now call equation blindness. People who in front of 2x = 4 start weeping. And this is being studied. Are they related? We don't know. What are they? What are these organic blocks? There are head waiters who have 10 languages effortlessly. There's no correlation with intelligence, whatever.
What on Geneva? We're nearly come to the end of this tape. So, just to how long were you in Geneva?
25 years.
25 years.
And I arranged a 7 months a year schedule. 5 months here, 7 months there.
5 months here and 7 months there. Yeah. And did you find it a very good place to teach? I mean, apart from the language, were the students good and the other?
Not as brilliant as they would have been here or at Harvard. Very mixed, but at the graduate level, absolutely international. And a city in which itself 4 or 5 languages are completely current and perfect for comparative literature. Right, I mean, tailor-made for that kind of vision of literature. And the center of Europe. Weekend, I'd be in Milan, down the road through the tunnel. I'd be in Paris. I'd be in Munich constantly, teaching, lecturing, drawing. It's a central point. There wasn't yet the Eurostar, remember? This island was even more insular than it is. And from a place like Geneva, you could live Europe, which is what I wanted to do.
Did you keep your contacts with Churchill at all?
Very much so. They insisted, and most generously, they made me an extraordinary, they called it fellow, which caused much mirth in the press and otherwise, and then a pensioner fellow. I'm there forever, I mean, as a founding fellow it was.
So did you teach at all at Churchill and
No,
Cambridge?
I never taught again. Never taught. But it is so full of ironies. 2 years after kicking me out, the English faculty puts gobbets, they called them, select passages from The Death of Tragedy on the Tripos paper. 2 years after asking me to leave. All right.
Just one last question before this tape finishes, which is about Leavis. Were you close to him? And
no, but his wife. Bulstrode Gardens was through the hedge to Churchill College. She took on undergraduate supervision for me. She was fabulous. she would take someone whom we had consigned to a third and say, you have no right to do that, and teach them into a good 2-2 or 2-1. She was a fabulous pedagogic force with a burning Puritan conviction that all human beings must be given the very best of intellectual challenges. And when she would invite me to 12 Bulstrode Gardens to talk about the papers, the shy little man would bring in the tea.
Lovely. Yes.
In Switzerland, the law is absolute. You are retired at 65.
I see. So, since then, have you taken on any career moves, or just...
I've been lecturing pretty much all over the place.
Yes.
But no formal regular teaching.
Yes. What do you mainly lecture on?
Oh, an embarrassing range of subjects and passions. There have been, very recently, for example, I went to Milan, to the university, and there I was lecturing mainly to the classics on certain very intriguing moments in Plato and how they have influenced political theory, poetics, and classical scholarship itself. I then went on to Turin, one of my favorite cities, and that was lots of fun. I did a lecture on one line in Dante's Commedia where Neptune, the god of the sea, is sitting on the bottom of the sea, and he looks up and he sees the shadow of the great ship Argo with Jason on it passing overhead. It's a totally magical and fantastic line. And I tried to get those who were working with me and my very large audience, what do you do after Capitaine Cousteau? That is to say, what do you do in a world in which seeing the shadow of a ship pass over your head as you're under the sea is a daily experience for countless snorkel divers, amateurs, deep sea divers, of course, of any kind, and has completely changed the quality of shock. The quality of shock which was surrealistic for Dante, inconceivable that one could ever see that from the bottom of the sea. And then I went through some of the surrealist poetry of Lautréamont, in which there are premonitions of this extraordinary moment. But the point of my lecture was, how do our readings live with the changes in our lives, in our technology, in our habits of consciousness? And then I went on to Genoa, and Genoa has a combined lectureship, the city council, the government, and Genoese business associations, which in Italy are very powerful. And they wanted to know, did I see any real future after Brussels in the hopes for European Union, which are very important for a commercial and harbour city like Genoa. So that was a completely different register of interest. So it very much depends on what my hosts are interested in. My next trips are in October. I'm going to Barcelona. Barcelona has a celebration in its Museum of History. I'm lecturing there. And then I'm presiding over a big international conference, which I have planned in Lisbon, in the Gulbenkian Foundation, where our question is, has science reached certain limits, certain frontiers? And there I'm simply chairing and speaking because there are very great scientists coming who are going to debate this.
If I can just pick up two of the points you made there. The first one was Brussels, and after Brussels, and is there any future for Genoa? What was your...
I'm extremely skeptical about any effective future for Europe. The turning point, I think, was, I may have referred to this last time, the total failure of Europe to be able to cope with what was inherently a minor crisis in Kosovo and its desperate pleas to America to come and get it out of the mess.
Yes.
I think that marked the end of many utopian views about European unity. I think there are two tasks left. I'm going to be developing this in Barcelona for today's Europe. Only two effective duties or tasks or hopes. One is to find out how different ethnic groups, cultures, religions can coexist. without, in fact, assimilating them. That is the biggest problem. We are not going to assimilate the great Islamic ghettos, which are now running into millions, of course, in France, Germany, and running into large numbers in Britain. The Turkish presence is not going to be assimilated in any classical, traditional sense, but we must try and work out modes of peaceful and indeed collaborative coexistence. And I'm emphasizing this wherever I lecture in Spain because of the great period of Judaic, Islamic, Christian coexistence in early medieval and southern Spain. The second task is the young in Europe have never been as hopeless, hope in a deep sense, not that they aren't going to make a lot of money, but no sense of an ideology, no sense of any political or utopian future. Never forget that if you don't commit great creative mistakes when you're young, the rest of your life is largely wasted. What were the great mistakes? Marxism, of course, for generations. Fascism also was an enormous mistake, but marshaled, for better or worse, marshaled the disciplined dreams of millions of young people. Zionism, in its particular regard. There were many wonderful mistakes you could make in the hope of giving your life to them. And if disillusion came later with maturity, you had at least lived the essential passionate commitment which should be that of the young. There is nothing of the kind today. Nobody is going to die for a hedge fund. Nobody is going to die for the enormous entertainment industries, for the mass media, for the athletic worship, which is all that the young have. So can we again find for the young things worth being wrong about, but wrong about in a creative and passionate way? Those, I think, are the two tasks, and they're very, very difficult.
Do you have any suggestions on the second?
Until there is again an effective left in Europe, we aren't going to get going. That is to say, since 1789 and the French Revolution, hope has always been on the left. Hope is now homeless. Hope is now fully homeless in Europe. We can't go back to any of the traditional left. They have turned out to be not only technically, economically erroneous, but they lead to the gulag in a certain sense. Did this have to be? Or are there modes of radical socialism? Are there modes of the famous third way, which we have simply let go in the enormous wealth of money that has poured over Europe? If we re-enter a period of economic stress, and I think we will, and of the collapse of certain vast luxury structures, there is a chance that a new form of left, in quotes, may evolve. But I wish my own age is such that I'm not really very qualified. I would like to know what the dreams of those young people are who are turning down city careers. They're not numerous. Certain movements command tremendous respect, in my opinion. The French movement, Doctors Without Frontiers, Barefoot Doctors, Médecins Sans Frontières, the various overseas volunteer movements. There are young people passionately committed to helping others in a very new way. If you were to ask me, have there been islands of hope? Yes, of light. I would like to name a few. Like no previous civilization, we're getting worried about ecology. No need to detail that. We know we're on a small, spoiled, ransacked planet, that there isn't much time left. There are a lot of human beings beginning to try and do something, even on a very small scale. Secondly, we are beginning to care for animals as never before. As you and I do this interview, the papers are full of people in flooded parts of Gloucestershire and of Oxfordshire saving animals at any price. We have, and not only pets, the sense that we owe to animals all the possible care, the hate of vivisection, the hate of the abuse of animals and of the cruelty. This is very new. There are tiny signs of it in the late Victorian period, but hardly before then. And the third and biggest is our sense that children are owed protection and care. The sense that the abuse of children the torture of children, the economic and sexual exploitation of children, make a civilization deeply suspect, is fairly new. The legal protection of children, the attempt to give poor children a chance of a decent life, these are, in my opinions, the rough elements, the volcanic magma, you might say, of what could become a new humanism.
Very, very interesting. Can we now go back over your writings a little bit? Your De Phil, which was turned into The Death of Tragedy, could you distill the essence?
Yes, this was in a sense, a question had been asked before. Why do great tragedies end roughly after Racine and Goethe in Western literature? Why is tragedy an archaic form? Why is it essentially a great part of the museum of the literary past? This was just before absurdist drama brought forward its own curious parodistic version of the past. You could argue that The Homecoming of Pinter is a fantastically intelligent meditation on Lear. There are many, many meditations on Shakespeare in Beckett in a disguised form. These are not, of course, tragedy in the traditional sense. So I developed a perfectly, I hope, common sense thesis that tragedy is tied to a metaphysics of divine intervention in human affairs, of divine enmity to man, etc., notions which had lost their strength very rapidly after the mid-18th century. And I did not believe at that time, still don't quite believe it, that you can have an agnostic secular tragedy.
And they'd lost their strength because of the scientific revolution and Descartes or what?
Every item of the change in industrial technological life, of urban life, modernity. Modernity is in essence agnostic.
What is modernity?
Certainly modernity is that we've somehow got to make it without anybody either looking after us or coming down to punish us when we get things wrong. Modernity is man's loneliness in a practical world.
So do you subscribe to the Weberian thesis of the disenchantment of the world?
Oh, very much so, the demythologizing. However, what he did not foresee was the development of kitsch mythologies such as those of pop and sport and the modern media. A phenomenon such as Mrs. Rowling's Harry Potter, or The Simpson Family, which is opening in 100,000 cinemas at midnight tomorrow. Great substitute mythologies, infantile mythologies, and this Weber did not really foresee.
And he also didn't foresee the resurgence of fundamentalist religion.
Outside the center of European culture, and, of course, in the United States.
Yes.
There are an estimated 40 million fundamentalists in the southeastern United States and in the Southwest. There are now, this is a figure that keeps haunting me, it came out of a recent survey, there's an estimated 20 million American adults who are quite certain that Elvis Presley has risen from the dead, and to whom the Christ statement, "The King is risen," is a literal truth.
And what is your theory for the resurgence of this kind of fundamentalism?
Oh, surely you yourself, as a social anthropologist, it's what I just mentioned, the terrible solitude. People who are prepared to try and cope with their own very small means are few. The hope, the wish for supernatural agency, intervention, and supervision is constant. The classic text there, a man I otherwise do not really care for very much, Carl Jung, the classic text comes just after the war. A wonderful little text in which Jung says roughly the following: "We have been left in a horrible state, largely destroyed. Very soon, people are going to be seeing flying objects." This is just after 45, and praying and hoping for extraterrestrial investigations of the Earth with a possible view to taking care of us. This comes before the great UFO wave. It completely predicted it and foretold it.
Reminds me a bit of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, where he talks about the surge of telling fortunes in teacups and haruspication and so on in a time of stress and anxiety.
Well, irrationalism is immensely powerful at the moment. There are 3 times as many registered astrologers in the United States as there are members of the Physics and Chemistry National Associations, 3 times as many. There are people all over London, highly successful billionaire businessmen who build their flats according to fake Oriental mystical arrangements. The wife of our recent and honored Prime Minister, Mr. Blair, wears an amulet against space rays and has consulted various total charlatanisms of New Age persuasion. Oh, a kind of cheap madness is everywhere around us.
You said that Carl Jung wasn't normally your favourite author, but who are your favourite authors and why?
Let me come back for a moment to Jung, because I have a really interesting problem there, or interesting to me. I completely reject psychoanalysis for all manner of reasons, but worship Freud as one of the enduring geniuses, not only of the language, but of cultural criticism, one of the great myth makers with Marx of all time. And I can follow a deep, humane, stern, caustic decency in Freud. I can't in Jung for obvious reasons, for his political behavior, but Freud understood next to nothing about poetic creation. Disgraceful is his famous essay on the poet as daydreamer, which argues that when you grow up, you get over this odd thing called poetry. He had virtually no ear for music, and his writings on art, the 2 great essays on Michelangelo's Moses and Leonardo, are among his least adult or persuasive. Jung has a formidable insight into poetic creation. Jung puts what the Greeks called poiesis, P-O-I-E-S-I-S, the process of shaping creation, at the center of the psyche, and knows about symbolism, and knows about allegory, and has a terrific feel for the still mysterious psychic, cerebral, emotional processes of creating a great work of art. So in that respect, anyone concerned with poetic aesthetic creation will be looking to Jung and not to Freud.
Right, and then coming back to authors, it's a huge question, but who do you think has most influenced you, 2 or 3?
I couldn't begin to deal with that. I'm brought up on Homer from about age 5, if not a little earlier. Homer is made daily bread to me by my father. I still regard certain things in Homer as finally unsurpassed. I will give an example because I'm lecturing on that very point in Venice in October. In the last book of the Iliad, book 24, King Priam comes to beg for the body of his slain son Hector from man killing Achilles. I know of no other text in any literature which reaches 1 or 2 of the summits of that text. For instance, a line in which the old man puts his lips on the man-slaughtering hands of Achilles, the hands that have killed his son. But then comes the utter climax. They weep. Achilles weeps for his old father, Peleus, P-E-L-E-U-S, and because Achilles knows he will soon die himself in battle. Priam weeps because he knows his city of Troy will be razed to the ground and burned to ash with all his 50 sons. And in that moment, Achilles quietly turns to Priam and says, "Now we have to eat, whatever our grief." Neither Shakespeare nor the Bible nor Dante has ever, in my opinion, dared that line. And the only one who could have coped with it would have been Tolstoy, who took it from Homer, who was steeped in Homer. Think of that line. The example that Achilles gives very quietly is another mythological figure, Niobe, Niobe, whose 10 children were killed in a vengeance by Apollo and Diana, and then the line is very simple, she fell to her food. That's the best translation we have, to try and make it very concrete. There's no cynicism in that line. There is no false modernist objectivity. There's a kind of transcendent understanding of life, of what human life is in the final analysis, which I think no other text quite matches. Or moments in the Odyssey, which I spent my whole life working on and dealing with. I then, of course, turn to Shakespeare, as everyone does, who accompanies my everyday. But in the last analysis, I know why Eliot prefers Dante to Shakespeare. This has nothing to do with comparative merit, that would be idiotic. It is that Dante's philosophic, intellectual grandeur, his passion for the life of the mind, his sense of how ideas work and how ideas become animate forces far transcends that of Shakespeare, who's not concerned with that aspect of life, who does not deal with philosophic doctrine and dogma. There are those who say, thank God, and that makes him the universal. Maybe, but I can't do at any point without Dante, and without the belief that finally the greatest poetry and the greatest intellectual understanding go together.
When you were talking about the depth of understanding of humans in Homer, I was thinking of King Lear on the heath. You know,
But, sorry, I have real trouble with that one. I have trouble, first of all, with the leap off Dover Cliff. At what level of absurdity are we meant to take that? The parody scenes in the hut with the fool are fantastic, surrealistic. They are a kind of metaphysical circus like no one else has achieved. I cannot identify with them. Any point. I can completely with Achilles' Let's Have Dinner. I can completely with the dog Argo, Argo, after waiting 20 years, raises his head when Odysseus comes back to the palace, lets his head be stroked and dies in that moment. He has waited for him. He has recognized him. There are 1,000 points in Homer which invite me to be more human. The Shakespearean case is much more complicated. There's another very curious point, and that's my French education. I plead guilty. You can cut vast chunks of Shakespeare. Everybody does. We haven't seen a complete production of Hamlet in about 30, 40 years, and it was done in this country only because the Russians, with pedagogic completeness, have not cut a single line out of their Hamlet. It's almost 5 hours. You can cut big chunks, and it's still transcendently marvelous. Don't try and cut a single line out of Dante or Racine or Homer. I was brought up in a classical aesthetic where totality of willed creation counts enormously. Shakespeare is a script writer. There's never been another on the face of the earth. Today he would write television scripts with delight and with virtuoso genius at every point, recreating the medium as he went along. But they are scripts, not the sonnets, which everybody likes to talk about and nobody reads. Not the sonnets, of course, but the plays are in motion. They're open-ended scripts. They are subject to production, direction, social context, not certain of these other classics, which in my French lycée education were the ideal criterion.
And coming to, of course they are poets too, but coming to slightly more poets, were any of the Romantics influential on you?
I hold the heretical conviction that Keats's letters are incomparable. They're Shakespearean. If we had the letters of a young Shakespeare, they'd be like Keats, much more than the poetry, which I think is often lush and almost embarrassingly adolescent for all its greatness. Shelley, you have to do in selected bits. I don't buy Leavis's all-out condemnation, but I know why he made it. Coleridge, I'm enveloped in, but it's also the Coleridge of philosophy, metaphysics, theology, political theory, science. And in late life, but this is the experience of many people, this is a cliche, Wordsworth has come to mean more and more to me. Things I had difficulties, great difficulties with, the Prelude, the Excursion, mean more and more to me. I think Wordsworth, in his epic structure, is a poet for the aged.
Ironic, since he thought he was writing about childhood. I was brought up in Hawkshead.
So you know that his country.
Very well, yes. To go back to your own writing, what was your next book after the death of
Well, I'd already been working on the book on Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, and that hammered out an immature, intuitive, unripe persuasion that very, very great literature depended on the possibility of the question of God being important. Not on believing in, but that the question, is there a God, had to be somewhere centrally serious and relevant to the great art, and that the way the Russian novel towers over all other prose fiction, why no other literature has a War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, Brothers Karamazov, A Crime and Punishment, and Idioms, is the ubiquity of the God question in Russian literature. And I tried to develop this, and the perfectly, I suppose, routine feeling, ask a person which of the two he prefers, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, and you have a shorthand portrait of that person. That's been said before. It meant not altogether seriously, but as a kind of very serious game.
And what about more recent writers? Are there any of the 20th century?
Oh, yes. I couldn't do without Beckett, of course, at any point. He is, to me, the transition to what lies ahead, the unknown that lies ahead. Oh, and Musil, M-U-S-I-L,
yeah.
Musil and Proust accompany me at every point. I distrust most Joyceans. Now, they have read select bits. I have worked my way through Ulysses with endless admiration and with fun and being very moved, but Finnegan's Wake is bluff, in my opinion, as are those who claim to have read it. They have not. They've all read Anna Livia Plurabella. We all have.
How do you spell her? Plurabella?
No, sorry. She's one of the most famous figures in literature.
Yes.
Don't make me angry. Anna
Okay, right.
Livia, Livia, Plurabella, Plurabella. She's the one who sings on the Liffey in Finnegan's Wake.
Yeah.
Anna Livia, Plurabella of the rivers flowing. Everybody, he himself recorded that passage. It is stunning. Ask people whether they've looked at anything else in that farrago, and I think they will finally honestly admit, of course you can't read it. As I was for, 26 years, the senior literary critic on the New Yorker, modern fiction poured across my desk. I knew that Nabokov was Nabokov from the word go. You can't read a sentence of Nabokov, even of his useful short stories, without knowing you're in the hands of a master. Constantly, yes.
What about Yeats? Do you have...
Yes. Yeats, the great poems are like no others. There is too much, and there is a great deal that is purple, and there is a great deal that is lush and self-indulgent. But the great Yeats is incomparable.
Good. He's my favourite 20th century poet. Coming back to poetic creation, you said that, I mean, it's a mystery, but do you have any views about the sources and springs of poetic creation?
My sadness is that I haven't had certain printing errors which commit you to immortality. Thomas Nash, Nash, sometimes with an E at the end, but scholars disagree on this, contemporary of Shakespeare, rival of Shakespeare, very envious of Shakespeare, translates Villon. Not translates in our sense, but adapts the famous ballads of Villon. There's one on the ladies of the past, where are they now? He translates beautifully a French line about Helen of Troy. And as she goes grey, brightness falls from her hair. Very beautiful line. His printer misreads the manuscript and gives us a brightness falls from the air, one of the great lines of world poetry, by which Nash is remembered and honored. And I've never had a printer nudging me into immortality. The luck of that era, that too can be great creation. The factors are probably too complex for any analysis. What it is that fires the synapse in the cortex into finding a metaphor, of this I keep worrying about, not worrying is the wrong word. I keep trying to read about it and to learn from those qualified to help me. Plato, who says everything, Plato, and I mean that, had we only Plato, we'd be all right. Plato says a metaphor is two areas of the brain brought into unexpected contact. There it is. He knew nothing about synapses, electric arcs. He was intuiting that in the metaphor, somehow unrelated centers of cortical activity are brought into collision and contact. It may be so. We cannot produce it by electrodes. We cannot find, to put it childishly, that area in the cortex, which is, we have language areas, smell areas. We're beginning to know a lot about music reception. There is no poetry area. There's no explanation of how children have produced very great verse, or the very young. Mystery is a too easy a word. It's a saving enigma. It's a saving riddle. What I would say is this, is that probably, great poetry, Shakespeare above all, results when you hear around a word all overtones and undertones. When, without having to look it up, without having to make it deliberate, something in you takes in a field of association, so that around the word you're using or hearing, as a musician may hear the overtones and undertones which he does not explicitly need to note in his score. Shakespeare seems to hear about, around every word, the totality of possible linguistic usages. What makes that possible? We know next to nothing. Will brain chemistry teach us more? It would be stupid of me not to think so. The progress being made in the study of cerebral lesions and functions is so rapid and dramatic, but I hope it won't be very definitive. I hope that this will remain enigmatic.
Do you know the study of, I think it's called The Road to Kubla Khan? Xanadu, yes.
By Livingston Lowes,
yes.
L-O-W-E-S.
Yes.
Yes, he was a Harvard professor. He was an immense presence, so dead already, in all our lives there. What he does is to trace Coleridge, what Coleridge called the hooked atoms of association.
Right. Galton's idea, yes.
Here, and how everything Coleridge read, heard about, hooked into a chain of rich association. But this remains completely at the surface, and Livingston Lowes would not have wanted to be mistaken for a depth psychologist. He probably despised depth psychology or did not believe in it. It doesn't take us very far. It's wonderful to know what books Coleridge read and where the distant chain of imagery, names, association, and sounds begins. It doesn't tell you why everybody else could read the same books and nothing would happen. This is the puzzle. Correlative experiences in different human beings, and in one human being the synapse fires. Look, in the primary school in Bern, the teacher on a school expedition, taking the little ones, the really little ones, to look at an aqueduct. They trotted out to look at an aqueduct. There's a beautiful Roman one near Bern. And she said to them, do your best to draw it, and handed out colored pencils and paper. And one child put shoes on the pillars of the aqueduct. And every aqueduct has been walking since. He was called Paul Klee. And luckily the teacher knew in that moment what she was looking at. No human being had ever put shoes on the pillars of an aqueduct. And now we know aqueducts are in motion, are indeed legs with shoes on. How does that happen in a 6-year-old? We have no clue. Hurrah for not having a clue.
Have you yourself written much poetry?
To my embarrassment, yes, because in French education, you wrote verse. It was part of the discipline. You even wrote on the baccalaureate a little Latin verse. God help us. And you wrote verse, almost to put it embarrassingly, this was the attainment of a gentleman, as you in Edwardian and Georgian England, so many wrote amateur verse. Then at Oxford, I published verse with a whole number of very distinguished other people in a little series of Oxford poems. And one day, one morning, I woke up with the full understanding that verse is the contrary of poetry. It isn't a lesser form. It's the absolute denial of poetry, and I've never been that stupid again. But yes, I did. I also started by drawing and painting a great deal, and I mentioned that last time. This may have been a mistake to stop.
And what about music? Are there...
No, the point being that in my time, music meant learning the piano, and my handicap made that impossible. So I was spared that humiliation. But of course, music is constant and indispensable. And I do love the Groucho. It is Groucho or Harpo Marx, one of the two. What instrument do you play? Lo-fi, middle-fi, and hi-fi. And that's entirely my case.
And which musicians? Which composers are your companions?
Sorry, from Guillaume de Machaut to John Cage and the present, there are great musicians at the moment. Nothing in music which doesn't seem to me worth learning about. Now, again, as a mark of age, I find myself turning to Haydn and to Haydn's chamber music more often than to some of the giants who I was concerned with earlier. There is in Haydn a gift of peace, a gift of calm forgiveness, a gift of acceptance, which I find almost nowhere else.
And Handel?
No, I'm not a Handelian. He is the rich man's Elgar. This is a very British conviction. I know how important he is. I find much of it, particularly the operas, monotonous to a degree.
Often you started off with your family background and the relationship to God, and you've mentioned him a number of times as central, at least asking the question about God. Do you ask this question?
I won't go into this. You will find it, so far as I can put it into language, in the book I'm publishing in January.
Oh, right. Can we know the title of the book you're publishing?
Yes, I'll gladly tell you about it. It's called My Unwritten Books. It's 7 chapters on 7 books I have not written and why. It may be no good, but it's totally original. No one has ever tried to do this. No one has ever tried to do this. Why did I not write 7 books, which I very much wanted to write, hoped to write, should have written, and I try to explain the inhibition in each case.
Can you just give us a sample of one?
With pleasure. For instance, one is on my confession that there are those of us who love animals better than human beings, who can be moved more deeply by the suffering of animals than by that of human beings. And it is the history of my life with our 4 Old English sheepdogs. I really did want to write that book. But to write well about animals needs tremendous luck and gift. It's something very few writers have ever quite achieved. And then there is one on the question you have just raised, the last chapter. What are my political and religious positions at the moment? Because I've so often been challenged, why don't you come openly, why don't you declare your politics? So I tried to in that chapter. One chapter is called Zion. Several times in my life there was the obvious chance to go to Jerusalem, to move to Israel. And my father was a member of the original Zionist Association in Vienna when he was a young man, so it goes back a long way. And I try to explain my failure of that. There are different aspects. One is the only time I've written erotica in my life. It is a chapter no one else, I believe, would have dared try, making love in different languages. It's an immense problem, central, the Don Juanism of language. No one has ever tried to do it. What is it which makes making love in one language so different from doing it in another? Where do the parasympathetic nerve systems of sex and language meet, and how do they influence each other? So each chapter is a book that I should have but did not write, and I try to explain.
Delightful. What a lovely idea. Well, I think we've probably taxed you enough, but are there things I should have asked you? What would you have asked yourself that I haven't asked you?
The most vulnerable of all, which you have been too kind to ask, and which is one of the chapters in this book, called invidia, the Latin word for envy, to spend your whole life among the alpha starred, to have them in the office next to you in the institute in Princeton, to have them here at the high table, to meet them at literary occasions, to hear them lecture, even to have had them in this house, the ones who change our lives, who create things, to have had Borges taking his afternoon nap in my wife's study, to have had for a time Crick and Watson as colleagues, to have not met with, but, met with, close to Derek Walcott when Omeros was published, one of the greatest of modern poetic works, and to know that one's own skills as commentator, teacher, explainer, a propagandist for quality, critic, are eternally doomed to being beta double plus. To know this clearly, to know it when you get up in the morning, to know exactly where the light years of difference lie, and that there can be no bluff. To know that in every field, the distance between Tiger Woods and the excellent runner-up, not today where Tiger has done badly, but almost any other time, you know what I mean, to play Federer at Wimbledon, the hopelessness of it, the strange hopelessness that nothing can leap that barrier. Now, certain literary criticism, by force of language, moves into the field of creation, usually by great creators, by Eliot, by Coleridge. It's entirely conceivable. The task of the teacher is the one I love most deeply, honor most deeply. We talked of this last time. It is an immensely important task of transmission. The privilege of carrying the mail, as I always put it. That wonderful film, Il Postino, where Neruda is shown in exile, and the local mailman and his relation. Neruda gives him his poems to put in the mailbox. I'm incredibly lucky and privileged to have been the mailman. And a number of times I've helped work to break through. When I published the first essay, I think in English, on the greatest German poet since Rilke, Paul Celan, C-E-L-A-N, the TLS very kindly asked me, how do you spell it? Because the name had never been heard. He's now 1,000 doctoral theses a month, etc. To have helped the real thing reach people, break through. My God, how lucky I am. But it will never, never fool me as to the essential second-ratedness of one's job. As an academic, as a commentator, which is happy to be a happy parasite. If one could somehow imagine a man who could do this would be Edward Lear. He could draw a happy parasite, but that's how I think of it.
Well, I was wondering, to distinguish, is this the Salieri complex? I mean, basically, you know as Salieri that Mozart is...
Yes, if you want, but it's much older than that. It's eternal. What was it? You'll read all about that if you care to look into my little book. What was it to have lunch next to Dante? It's part of the human condition. The alpha are very, very few, and they are different from us. Very Jejune remark of Fitzgerald, the rich are different from us, and Hemingway's stupid answer, they have more money than we do, which is really as silly as you can get. That's on a main minded. The creating those who are electric with the step into the unknown are different from us. Often it is luck. Linus Pauling, whom I have met, was 2 weeks away from the DNA breakthrough, as we know, having already 2 Nobels before then. Think of that. 2 weeks away. When Wallace and Darwin.
Yeah.
So many cases, not probably in the arts, where nobody else can be Schumann or Schubert or Chopin. There is one, and though around him there are many sustaining forces, without any doubt. The sociology, even of the greatest artist, is complex. It is contextual in part. But in one night, fed up with his bullying father, in one night, Kafka sits up all night, being a notorious insomniac, and writes his first great, great story, The Judgment, which contains just about the whole of modern literature, in one night. And that's what it's all about. And if I can get people to be as excited as I am about it, to read it with me, to try and understand it, if I can get the people around my table, as I did in Geneva in our seminar, to learn by heart some of the poetry I love supremely, I've been incredibly lucky, incredibly lucky.
We probably should end there, but I'm intrigued. Is it the job? In other words, is it literary criticism, which means that you can never be alpha? Do you know Yeats's poem, The Scholars, where
Yes.
bald heads scratching...
And I know Yeats's Monuments of Unaging Intellect, and I know much. Yeats's own prose, forgive me, is embarrassing. I mentioned already Eliot and Coleridge, of course many more, who step into literature with their criticism, but they're usually great poets, so that it is an ancillary act.
Do you know any literary critic who you would say was right up there?
No, because the business of criticism is itself secondary in essence. There are very great critics who played a major role in the history of culture, of thought, of education. Matthew Arnold, a Leavis, a Trilling, and my predecessor on the New Yorker, Edmund Wilson, who shaped taste. But it is a secondary. If Edmund Wilson had not written about Joyce, Hemingway, and helped launch Great Gatsby, somebody else would have. It is a distributive function, not an autonomously singular function.
But I think just you don't need consolation, but your work has changed people's lives.
Well, I'm very grateful, and as I say, that's why I kept saying I'm lucky, but it's not the same thing. Please bear in mind, Nash, a brightness falls from the air, and no one else can have that. It's incredibly unfair. It's incredibly... why has God, or the devil, I prefer to think of it as the devil, been so terribly clubby and unjust in his distribution of great creative gifts? But they have. And at 6 years old, one is Paul Klee, or one isn't. And reflect on that example of the walking aqueduct. Reflect on the complexity or divine simplicity of a child's discovery. And you can't fake that. That's the wonderful thing. You can't bluff real creation. Endless people try to make it as if it were like, no, it isn't. It may take time to be fully recognized. It may, oh God, be destroyed by political horror, by illness, by... I don't believe in mute, inglorious Miltons, but they may exist, of course. And we simply, by definition, would know nothing about it. But Sainte-Beuve, the great French literary critic, Sainte-Beuve, B-E-U-V-E, Sainte-Beuve said, in his bitter jealousy, in his devouring jealousy of Balzac and Stendhal, they will never build statues to critics. He was probably wrong. We live now in a parasitic culture where the critical, the commentary far exceeds the work. Endless people, this drives me to distraction, buy biographies of great writers, artists, and never read a word writer they're reading about. And let's close on a polemic note.
Yes.
There were many reasons why the Faculty of English of Cambridge University decided they did not wish me around. One of them was that while I was still lecturing, they put on the tripos for commentary, a passage from Eliot's famous essay on Dante to students who had never read a line of Dante. And I made no secret of my view of the treason of the clerics, to use the famous phrase, of what this involved. That one doesn't do. One doesn't set criticism of Dante to those who've never read a word of the Commedia.
Let's end on that note.